Good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick, the TrainingPeaks WKO4 product manager. This is a very full webinar, and I still see people rolling on here. As a matter of fact, this webinar was oversold, so I'm hoping everybody gets in. Going to jump in tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about new training metrics. As most people on this list will know, we introduced additional training metrics last week of stamina. So I really want to give an overview of all the metrics. Some of it you've seen before. I'm going to kind of go over that pretty quickly and really talk about use. I got to give you a heads up. I've been a little under the weather for the last day or two. Seem to have picked up a spring bug here. So my prep isn't as good as normal. So I'm sure we'll see a typo or two. During this presentation, I want to be clear, there's places I'm going to give an opinion as a coach. Most of you know me as working really on the software side, but my background more is in the coaching. I work with several professional athletes. At this point, I don't coach as much as I used to because I spend a lot of time looking at a computer screen and working on software, but I do have a basis. That reality means that some of my things might be opinions. I'm going to try to say when something's my opinion. I am not argumentative about coaching, meaning I know there's a lot of right. It's not as black and white as some people want to paint it. So I'm going to suggest some ideas and ways of looking at things that hopefully prompt your thinking. Part of the power of WKO4 is you can create it custom your way, your data, your metrics, what you want to see. So I'll give you some ideas and stuff like that. What I really encourage in this webinar is ask questions as we go. I'm pretty comfortable fielding the questions. Every once in a while I might go silent for 5 seconds because I'm reading a long one, so try to keep them short. But I like to ask them as I go. You know, it's almost like I wish everybody wasn't on mute because we could interact a little better. But the reality is if we do that, we're going to hear about 20 people washing dishes, listening to music, and watching the NBA game. So here we go. Jumping in, it looks like everybody's on. All right, let's get the technology rolling here. Tonight we're here to cover the training with power duration metrics. As I said, we're going to talk specifically about Pmax, FRC. We're not really going to talk much at all about FTP. That really has been done time and time again, but I'll give a little highlight on it, and then we're going to talk about the new metric stamina. 3 things I want to review as a little bit of background. I want to talk about the specificity principle. Part of what we're targeting and what we've done in WKO4 is we're continuing to utilize analytics, build an analytical engine, to give us the ability to individualize our training. And if you've been to some other presentations, you know that's a big hot topic and focus of mine. Today we're going to talk a little bit about specificity and the effects of specificity on training and how these metrics can come into play. We're going to specifically talk about in the role of what I call cost benefit. I'm going to give you a 2-second overview here in a second, and we'll discuss it as we go through the process. And one of the principles that I use in my training, so opinion alert, is this thinking of developing things in an intensive and extensive manner, which I'll go into and I'll show you some examples of how that works. Okay. The first 2 I'm going to tackle in the first couple of slides by showing you some examples of a power duration curve. So talking about specificity and the role of cost benefit. When we see a power duration curve, and this is one right here on the screen representing some athletes' estimated maximal power based off Dr. Andy Coggin's power duration curve metric. So the reality is this looks like what most people would expect. This is a logarithmic curve, so it's showing more intense data here at the lower numbers, and it kind of compacts as you get longer and longer. This one happens to go out for 10 hours plus. This curve, which we constantly refer to as a curve, is really a sigmoidal shape, and the reality is it's sort of like an inverted S. And this would suggest, from a shape sense, and it is sort of true from what we're going to talk about, is that if you impact one part of this curve, one part of this sigmoidal shape, sigmoidal curve, we will create a change in another part of the curve. It's kind of like one of those little games like in a restaurant when you're a kid where you're trying to kind of get the metal straight type of deal. Well, that's the reality of building or tracking our power duration relationship to our fitness. What we like to believe is generally is we start training, we introduce a training stimuli, our power duration curve moves from basis, and it gets something like immediately or maybe not immediately, I'm sure we wish we're immediately, but it's over time, the curve just gets like 10% better. So in this example, I just took a power duration curve and I times it by 110%. So if we assume the athlete gets 10% more fit, performance increases 10%, we see no change in the sigmoidal shape. It basically remains in the same 10% variance relationship to the curve. And we don't see any specificity in training introduced here. We simply are suggesting that the athlete gets more fit, and therefore all performance ranges improve. That might be true in a long shot of somebody totally getting off the couch who hasn't trained for a long time, but the reality is probably everybody on this call knows, or at least has experience with, even if they haven't been able to explain it really well, is it never changes in that neat little curve. What happens is, as we work on things, what occurs is, let's say we take a specific point, and I'm just picking something here. I'm sorry, my mouse is going a little crazy. I'm just picking here a point, let's say around, I don't know, 35, 40 seconds. I didn't pick it for any reason, just put a line there. And we say, gee, I wanted to impact this area. Well, there's two ways you can improve to move this red line to the green line, right? You could push it up, and that would move the curve up to here, and that would intersect. Or you could move it out. You could push it to the right, and that would make the curve here. If you thought about it, it would simply do that. So training and some type of training development would push by either pushing it up from below, pushing it more intensely higher, or pushing it to the right more extensively to the right. That we would impact the curve here, and the change here would sort of float all boats and lift the entire curve. Unfortunately, the reality doesn't work that way. Now, I drew this fancy gray line, so if it isn't as smooth as the actual red line, you have to forgive my mouse handling skills, but I think you'll get the point. The reality is, if I picked a point on a curve, let's say I was picking a point on the power duration red curve, and I wanted to move that point forward by same strategy. I'm pushing it up from below, intensive, right? And then also pushing it over to the right in an extensive format. I could raise that point. This is, I don't know, who knows, 25, 30 minutes. And you can see the whole tail potentially could raise with it. This is guys, I just made this up, but you actually see it happen. The reality is, when we start talking about training, that's what occurs. There's a specific area we're targeting. We're never really targeting everything. We're targeting a specific area. This athlete was looking for some power range between 20 and 40 minutes, and they received a benefit for it. We see a change from the starting curve to the ending point. We probably tracked it over time, getting better, better, better. Some combination of training stimuli that we introduced has improved that. But the unfortunate reality of training is somewhere there was probably a cost. And in this example, we see the cost here. That same reality, again, no making fun of my gray curve, could happen if you did it in the reverse. If you were tackling something very anaerobic in the 1 to 2 minute range, we could move it left, right. We could attempt to raise it from below, push it out to the right. We could have a pretty great impact here. So our benefit would be, improvement in this kind of shorter range capability, but there tends to be a price down here. The reality is it comes from a focus. If you really want to move a point in your power duration relationship, which often is necessary for peak performance, depending on race, format, ability, everything else, you always have to be thinking in cost benefit. So when you get into understanding that we have multiple metrics available, why it's so important to have multiple metrics that go beyond just MFTP or FTP tracking, is that it gives us better insight into the cost benefit of our training stimuli, whether you're prescribing it as a coach or undergoing it as an athlete or both. It gives us the ability to track that cost benefit. So one of the things when I work with coaches and athletes is I try to make that a principle that people understand, coach or athlete, that most things aren't going to float all boat. We're not going to get just a 10% improvement across the board. We're going to use specificity. We're going to understand that we're targeting a specific benefit, but we also need to understand that there's a cost. I can tell you that for me as a road racer, when I race, I have a pretty good sprint. I'm pretty good anaerobically, and I don't really have a good threshold. I need to spend a lot of time continuing to work on my threshold, because the reality is if I spend time trying to even improve my sprint or improve my shorter distances, my threshold will immediately drop, and it's irrelevant how fast I can sprint when I'm not even in the lead group close to the finish. So for me, I have to use my knowledge of myself coupled with specificity to say, gee, even though I'd like to and I find it easier to work on distances here, I need to spend a lot of time actually doing this, which still costs me some sprint. But the reality is I have to make that decision. If I want to be in the race in the end, I've got to raise my threshold. So just think cost benefit as a principle throughout. Final thing is this idea of intensive versus extensive. If we did the same thinking, these two curves, right, we want to affect a pretty good area. So if you want to affect a pretty good area in a curve, think about if I just chose one point and I'm just said, I'm going to train harder each day at 35 seconds. Again, I don't know why I chose 35 seconds, but you could push this curve up. Your 35-second power would get better and better and better, assuming you were doing full-on maximal efforts. And it would continue to get better to some point of diminishing returns. But what you would do in your curve is you'd probably create a neat little bump. It would pull it up some, but it would just be a bump like that. That is intensive building. You're pushing up below by doing maximal efforts of a certain power range output, which we'll talk about levels here shortly. The other option, so when you do them hard, it raises to a certain point. But again, it would create a bubble. That is intensive work to push that up. The other option is you can do extensive work. So instead of increasing the power, you can increase the time, the length you can hold that power, which we call fatigue resistance. Fatigue resistance is a broader suggestion, but that's an excellent example of it. So this is extensive thinking, that you're pushing things to the right. You're extending your power output to get stronger, and that's an extensive push out. The reality is a combination of these two create the best power output, because what happens is, I'll go back a couple to make this visually easier. What happens is it makes like a suspension bridge, right? You'd make a spike here and a spike here. Now think about the sigmoidal shape. You'd pick it up sort of like a suspension bridge, and you'd make a much bigger, wider effect. You might have reasons to be a little more specific, but the use of both extensive and intensive training stimuli at all different levels, I'm showing at a short level here, it's the same at longer durations, often is the best way to improve or to move the curve over the broadest range of durations. So that introduces some ideas just to talk about this idea of specificity, this idea of cost benefit, and this idea of intensive extensive. Andy and I, and supported by Debbie Martin, our amazing graphics maker, developed this comparison to give a little example of extensive or intensive thinking as a kind of macro overview. And what you have here, there's plenty of recordings on eye levels and stuff like that I can direct people to, but here's your classic levels on the left showing the classic 7 levels, of which level 7 is really a maximal effort, so it doesn't really count as a level. And here you have it being compared to eye levels. We're using color to show intensity, and the reality is eye levels are individual, so they don't always, we made them neat little shapes that all seem the same, but they might slightly vary by you. Here in the middle, though, we tried to give an understanding of training targets, and as things get more intense, we look at this idea of training as aerobic endurance, aerobic power, extensive, intensive. Endurance power is another way of kind of stating that. Here we go, anaerobic, extensive, intensive. So again, part of why we've done eye levels was to create multiple target points. And these are trackable now by the metrics we introduced. So what you're getting is a higher level of specificity. We are introducing a training stimuli specifically meant to improve our power duration model either through intensive or extensive work. And then we're tracking it in a more specific manner to see the adaptation to such stimuli. That's the nature of all training right there. All right, let's jump into the metrics, right? Let's start with Pmax. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Most people have this definition. Pmax is the maximal power that can be generated for a very short period of time. Units are watts or watts per kilogram. The maximal power over at least a full pedal revolution with both legs. Why a full pedal revolution? Because it avoids power spikes. You know, as a coach, I work with athletes or see data, and somebody will say, I have a 1,600 watt sprint. My question right off the bat is always, what's the average of your top 5 maximal 1 seconds? Oh, that's like 1,200. Well, the reality is you probably don't have a 1,600 watt split. There are, you know, power meters have some failability. I mean, the reality is we can get some bad data and data spikes. Pmax gives us a cleaner view because it uses at least 1 full revolution of data. Also, it cleans up the data because most units record data at the end of the recording rate or the record rate. Think about it, if you're pedaling at 100 cadence and recording once per second, there's extra data being broadcast because you're pedaling faster, event-based data, versus what's being recorded. What a lot of people don't understand in a 1 second max is it's wherever you were at when the next recording, the last piece of data held. So actually it can be over or under a little more significantly than people think. Use of Pmax avoids some critical power issues. The critical power model against power duration model, that's an argument that goes on, but the reality is the power duration model is not subject to the infinite time, infinite power issue because it's capped. And the reality is Pmax is probably better than 5 second max because at that stage you're having some fatigue come in and affecting the maximum number. Pmax standards for men, the average is 211, for women 988. There's now a chart, and I think it's in the new chart library, but if not, I'll make sure tomorrow that we push it up for you, showing this that Donnie built out of our Facebook group. The average is 1,211. You can see low, medium, high ranges. So a low range is around 939 watts, a medium range is 939 to 1483, and high is 1483. These are not age adjusted, and this is a pretty good set of core data. We're continuing to expand that now that we're tracking it. Women, you see the same relationship, giving a little understanding of kind of what the numbers are. Factors that are in Pmax, it really is just to measure the increase or decrease in maximal hour outputs over the course of training or detraining. Obviously, you're not always just getting fit. You could be losing fitness. It also helps us determine the maximum consumption rate of FRC, something I'm going to go into in a moment. And it gives us insights into, you know, how we develop and implement race strategies. If you know your Pmax, it really should tell you and give us some pretty good insight, particularly if you understand here against norms, how you can race and change strategies. Core driver behind Pmax, when you say what's the physiological factors behind this, so just using the physiological report in WKO4, and I pushed a new one into the library. I pushed this one. So if you use your new chart library and just search physiological report, you'll find a new report mimicking what I have on the screen. I'm looking at 3 professional riders. Some data obscured because I don't have permission to use these are my athletes, but do not have permission to show everything for everybody. Here's a pro mountain biker with a solid sprint. We see they have 62% of muscle fiber area dedicated to slow twitch. So they have a little more fast twitch fiber. I don't have a pure sprinter right now. I wish I did. I'd show you an example. Here's another pro all-arounder with an average sprint. You can see he's got a little less fast twitch fiber because his slow twitch fiber is higher. And here's a pro stage racer climber type of rider, very successful pro. We can see, excuse me, sorry about that, snuck up on me. We can see a whole lot of slow twitch fiber. The further down you are in that number, the lower number your slow twitch. You could always use the inverse. Our report just shows slow twitch estimated based off a formula. We definitely see that the more slow twitch fiber you have, the less Pmax. Excuse me while I take a drink. Simple way to review a season and use these numbers. This is one of those athletes. Pmax is being tracked in the purple, FRC is in green, and modeled FTP is in orange. It's really important to look at the relationships between these. The reality is, you can see something interesting here, even though the scale could be a little bit better, is this was a lot of 2015, as you can see, February to September. This person trains through the winter. They're kind of steady. They're a stuck trainer in base training. They come out. They actually rest. You can see their threshold dropped a little in here. And as soon as they lay off, I'll show you an example with CTL in here a little bit, their FRC starts shooting up. So we're working, we're building CTL. Something happens. Actually, he had to have a little bit of surgery. So we get off. He loses a little fitness. As soon as he gets back on it, his FRC is better. He's recovered. His Pmax goes down. The reality is we weren't doing anything because of an injury. We were really avoiding super hard efforts. He comes back. We're working it, we're covering. Here we're really back full scale. You could see it looks minor, but his threshold is actually increasing to a little over 400 watts here. He's driving for Mountain Bike Nationals last year in July. And you can see as his threshold's coming up, he's getting more fit, he's rebuilding. His Pmax is increasing. Part of this was the injury recovery, and we're starting to train it, so we see it moving up quite nicely. His FRC actually drops. I'll go into FRC in a moment, because we did a real hard block in here. Fatigue settles in, slows him down a tad, and then we see by race period he really is on form. His FTP is as high as it can be. His Pmax is falling because we tapered a little in here. Taper. As soon as you taper, look what happens to his Pmax. Bam! Shoots right up. And then even his FRC, a little slower in responding, comes right up to it. As I said, that Pmax, and this is a little complex, and gladly, again, please feel free to ask questions as I go. So Pmax caps your maximal burn rate of functional reserve capacity. Functional reserve capacity is similar to anaerobic work capacity, so it's a match. I'll go into it in a moment. So Pmax shows us the maximal burn rate. You can build charts in WKO4. I'm going to show you also the relationship between a joule. We track FRC in joules and watts. 1,000 watts is 1,000 joules, or 1,000 joules. So the reality is it's pretty easy to translate. If this rider's Pmax is 1,106 watts, they could probably maintain a max sprint of 1,106 watts for 19 seconds from an energy-based reality. That doesn't mean they can't, that they can. Some other barrier could be there. Some muscular effect form, all kinds of things can interfere with that, but it gives us the cap, the uppermost burn rate of FRC. You simply aren't going to burn that W, that anaerobic work capacity, your anaerobic energy, your anaerobic fuel, faster than that. That is the absolute cap and maximum. It's important to note that because I'll show you some in FRC, so I'm just putting it in now. So when it comes to giving a couple of training tips, one of the things that people have asked for was training tips. So I'll try to give a couple here for each area. You know, it's kind of some a little more in-depth than others. Again, I'll gladly take questions and answer questions. So when it comes to training on sprint, you know, this one's somewhat black and white. The reality is you need to do sprints. And I guess I could have put this in the chart or in this slide, but you can take this note. One of the places I see the biggest mistake, I do a lot of camps and interactions and things like that, is that we assume a watt is just power. Remember, a watt is how hard you're pedaling times how fast you're pedaling. And I see in today's world, as we all think power, 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 there's little attention to technique and cadence in sprinting. So for me, when I start thinking about Pmax development, I'm not just thinking about the power side of it. I'm also thinking about the pedal speed, the cadence, the foot speed, the rate coding, the mental activation, all the things that go into that sprint. Right off the bat, or I would say WKO4 gives you a better tool, is you actually now have an understanding of a Pmax training zone. So this is individualized if you use individual zones. For this particular athlete, they need to go over 915 watts per sprint to be creating enough stress and strain to expect adaptation, i.e. improvement in Pmax. And then you can do that up to 0. I mean, 0 is not going to get you, let's say, 1 or a handful of seconds, all the way out to 13 seconds. So it's helping me define not only the power to improve Pmax for this athlete, but giving me a time range to improve Pmax for this athlete. So then for me, my thinking always goes into this idea of intensive and extensive, and it can be seen very clearly here in eye levels. So a simple workout to develop Pmax is what I call the old 52s. This is a sprint workout that uses 50 meters and 250 meter sprints. 5 times 50 meters in little ring, max cadence, no shift. It's pretty hard to go 50 meters if you're starting in a small enough ring. I mean, you get spun out. You should be looking and measuring cadence there, as importantly as power. The faster the athlete can apply power, both in form and function, the higher their Pmax will go, and the better sprinter they will be. There's multiple phases to sprinting, but that certainly is just a core reality of sprinting. One of the things I would recommend between sprints is rest a lot. If 4 minutes isn't enough, go 5 minutes, go 6 minutes. Too many people get bored in sprint workouts. They do a 50-meter sprint, they roll right back to the start line, and 2 minutes later they're doing another one. Let the system fully recover. The whole theory is maximal. And the reality is you have a target here, right, of 9:15. If you're going below that target, you're probably not resting enough. Another use for this metric and this idea in WKO4, you can set a lower limit threshold, what I call the go home threshold. When you can't do this anymore, go home. And I'm going to show you some examples of that later. Then after a good rest in between, just 5 times 250 meter sprints, big gear, 2 shifts, max speed. 5 might be pretty hefty. You might end up with 3. But again, what I'm starting to do here at 250 meters is I'm pushing out into this range. I'll show you a better example here in FRC. But I can set a lower threshold. When the athlete can't sustain this amount, they go home. In the old days, and I know in training racing with the power meter, Hunter and Andy put out a percentage number, like if you drop below the second or third interval, go home. Well, now you have that number right here on time and power. You don't need the math. You don't need to do percentages. Just use what's right in eye levels. The second and easy to, so that's an intensive. These are maximal efforts, maximal foot speed, maximal power. Extensive efforts. So here's another way to think how to use this, right? So if you notice, remember what I showed you in the chart, it's not like the moment I go 1 more watt than this, that's a mistake of the old classic levels. If I go 1 more watt than my VO2 max zone, I'm absolutely working on anaerobic capacity. The reality is it's transitional. So the reality is it's transitional in its sense. It overlaps, and that's why we're giving you a better understanding of where these overlaps happen. So if I want an extensive, I got a very good question. I'll answer your question, John. That's a great one. The second one. Here's what I'm doing is I'm taking, for extensive power intervals, I'm taking 8 times 110% of the FRC edge. You'll see me use this word. So there's my edge, 13 seconds. I see this transitional phase. I want to go just a tad into the Pmax FRC zone. So think about what I'm saying here. This interval is pushing up, intensive. This workout is intensive. I'm going to use this at times intensive. This interval is extensive. I'm pushing out how much I can hold power. So I got 2 questions there. 1, can you demonstrate a fast find method for finding, for instance, efforts targeting Pmax range? No, John, we don't have fast find in WKO4. It's something we're considering doing, but we have better ways to do it. In your chart library, look up matches, go to the chart library at the athlete or at the workout level, and just search. In the search term, just put matches. The matches are set by FTP levels and different levels. Just set one, the expression could be level 2 Pmax, and it'll turn everything red in the horizontal chart or whatever chart you build it in. It'll show you the matches in the chart, so you can actually see when they're happening, when they're occurring. Second point, it's hard to see wattages when eyes are crossed and 110 violent efforts. Any suggestion? Yeah, it's more of a descriptive thing, right? You're probably looking at it after. In Garmin, I would definitely run interval reviews And the reality is even hitting your button of stopping the interval is next to impossible. So the reality is it is pretty hard to do. I don't look at the power. When I know it's super fatigued, I'll have the athlete, I do have the athlete try to hit start and stop. And then you should have an interval review screen set up on your Garmin and you look back during rest. When you miss 2 workouts or 2 intervals that you can't hit that minimal number, that's when I would go home. 1, sometimes is a mistake. 2, you're done. Okay, pressing on. Simple ways you can track FRC, and this is tracking. This is not, and guys, remember what slide number, if you guys want anything individual, it should be in the chart library, but feel free to email me at tim@WKO4.com and I'll send you these charts. Some are custom to me, but I don't mind sharing them. This is a tracking of Pmax. The purple line is Pmax. The blue line is CTL. The yellow area is TSB. And gray and white are 10-second max and 5-second max. Oftentimes, to be more specific, I might put the person's edge number in there, so MMP13. I'll just tweak this slightly for an example for the group. You can see as this person's peaks got better, they're doing occasional sprint work, you can see the FRC tracking right along with it. This tells me that some of the stimuli that I'm doing in here, what I'm doing as a coach and applying, when we test, when we need that, it goes up, we see the improvements in FRC occurring. So a simple process of tracking. I like to look at it TSB, CTL, so I also understand the relationship to fitness. You can see for this athlete, they're actually not getting any more fit. They're kind of bouncing along about 95, 90 to 100 TSS, which is classic, right? For many of us that have jobs and stuff like that, that's all the training you can do, so you do it. And it is what it is. But we see by content of training, there's no pattern in his fitness. It really is training content. As a coach, you still have to know the stimuli you're applying and make decisions on is it working or not. But if I sat down with this athlete and said, hey, athlete, I'm making your sprint stronger, it's hard to argue with, right? It's clearly in the numbers. All right, let's talk about functional reserve capacity. Functional reserve capacity is very similar to anaerobic work capacity, but I'll point out some of the differences. It is the total amount of work that can be done during continuous exercise. Remember, it's continuous. People seem to forget that. It's not on, off, recover, or anything like that. It's continuous exercise above FTP before fatigue occurs. Total fatigue, meaning you've got to shut down. The units are in kilojoules or joules per kilogram. Functional reserve understanding is simply like a battery. You have an anaerobic battery. And once you go over threshold and you're drawing anaerobic energy, that anaerobic energy is draining the battery. And that battery it's pretty limited. So as you drain the battery down, you start using it. Depending on how hard you're using it, the faster it goes down. So the higher the demand on the battery, the faster it goes down. The highest demand you can elicit is Pmax. So if you have 1,000 watts of Pmax, you're going to draw 1,000 joules a second. And that's the fastest burn rate you can burn your battery down. So the Pmax determines that maximal drain. If you're not going 1,000, if you're going 500 or something in between, the decline rate isn't as steep. But when that battery goes empty, you're empty. You got to recharge. The only way to recharge is to go back below threshold, often way below threshold, depending on if you totally dumped it or not. And there really is no other thing. Your body simply will not perform. You have no anaerobic energy left. That battery is totally drained. It won't recharge until you rest it. A lot of questions about can we track this dynamically? I know some other softwares are saying they do. Well, I guess they kind of do, to be fair. I guess you could look at a general population pattern, right? The trick is understanding the recovery rate. Andy and our team, Dr. Andy Cogg and our team, we have looked at it and are continuing to look at it. We just can't find something that works for the individual as well. And in these type of incidents, making kind of generalized assumptions of recovery is a really bad idea because the burn rates between human beings are very similar. That's very predictable. I'm going to show you your kilojoule numbers if you're tracking it. It's the recovery that's highly variable from person to person, and it's highly variable day to day. It can depend on chronic fatigue, nutrition, health, so many things. So a recovery rate you have today, do 3 more hard workouts in a row the next 3 days, is not going to be the same recovery rate you have 4 days from now. So we're just cautious to put out data that can lead to some misconceptions. It's not a bad construct. It's a good start. Other people are taking a whack at it. We just aren't there yet because we don't believe we can do it accurately enough yet. Okay, how does anaerobic work capacity compare to functional reserve? I'm going to save you a lot of reading. They're basically the same. Ours just takes into effect there's a small amount of aerobic contribution while you're going anaerobic, so we believe it's slightly more accurate. They're similar. You wouldn't find a big difference. Ours is functional. It's not laboratory. If you're looking at the actual power you can put out while you're fully anaerobic, you're still breathing, right? There's still some aerobic activity going on. W, or anaerobic work capacity, doesn't necessarily take into account that slight contribution from aerobic, where functional reserve does. Functional activities, our approach towards functional is always about what you can do on the road. Ranges for normal, the normal range is 9.0 to 35, 6.2 to 24K. Low, medium, high numbers, you can see 22 high, 13 to 22 medium, below 13 low. See similar numbers for female standards. These are continuing to be updated. These standards and tracking have not been around for a long time, and they're not age-coded. FRC converts. A kilojoule is simply 1,000 joules, and a joule is equal to watts times second. So it's J equals W times S. So when you're doing 400 watts for 5 seconds, you've used 2,000 kilojoules, or 2,000 joules, or 2 kilojoules. This just means you can do the math of that burn rate. Again, there is some recovery in aerobic, so it's not a nice clean number, but it's something we can predict, and I'll show you here in a moment. As I said, it's capped by Pmax. The higher your watts, the closer you are to Pmax, the faster you're going to deplete. Just based on this thinking, the higher the watts, the faster you're going to deplete. The lower the watts, the slower depletion. That's why you can go at 105% of threshold for 20, 30 minutes, but at 115% of threshold, that time period gets pretty short. By 135% of the pressure threshold, it's, what, 2 minutes, a minute and a half, maybe 3, depends. Key factors in use, really, we've kind of gone over that. I'm just trying to keep us on pace. A core driver. So again, we come back here to the muscle fiber type. In this anaerobic reality, we have a relationship to muscle fiber. You can see it just below. My little, I thought I put some animation here. It's not working. Look at the same 3 athletes. We can see lower amount of slow twitch, medium amount of slow twitch, higher slow twitch. Look at the relationship to FRC, right? Higher FRC, more fast twitch, more capability of going anaerobic. The anaerobic, it's not efficient, but they do the anaerobic work, your fast twitch muscles. Slightly lower, and here we have significantly lower because of more fast or slow twitch muscle. So it's pretty interesting. You see all these models and estimates, mainly created by Andy and others, really giving some excellent insight. You could track this over time and other factors, by the way, which really helps you see athletes. I think I have a sample of that coming up. Now you're back to burn rates. This report is called FRC Burn Rates. It should be in your chart library. This is an estimate and a construct, but it does take that same idea. If there's a maximum and there's a range, we have the ability to time to exhaust at MFTP at 110%, at 130. So basically filling in the range here should give us insight into the number of seconds, the time, the duration that an athlete can maintain that. So that's a pretty good report, but also just know it's an estimate. Again, you go back to this point that we're going to get a little more aerobic contribution and it can change day to day, but it does really help you think through race performance and actually response to training stimuli if you're trying to move it extensively. When should they start a sprint? How hard can they go to make a break happen? It really can give you excellent insight into understanding your athlete. Well, if they're going to attack in a break at 150%, I know they're going to run out of gas. I'm just using this one here in about 55 seconds. I don't want them to run out of gas if they're making the break. So go your 150 watts, but I want you shutting and settling down, maybe down to threshold or just above or just below at 30 to 35 seconds so we don't fully empty that tank. So it can be pretty impactful in working with performance and response to training, the bigger that number gets, the more capable I am of making breaks stick or long sprints or whatever it might be. One of the most intriguing things, and these charts are also available for you, is as we focus with Pmax and stuff like that, we tend to be more on the intensive side. In FRC, we can start to think about this extensive thinking, move the curve to the right. Moving the curve to the right is really about improving fatigue resistance. Fatigue resistance, and I see a couple questions coming in, I'll answer them in a minute. Fatigue resistance is this ability to go at a certain power and sustain it. So these charts are pretty cool. Donnie Key helped build them. I know Dean Golich helped build them, and myself. We were just kicking them around for a while, and then it went into the Facebook group. And by the way, if you're not in the Facebook group, get in the Facebook group. It really is amazing, and people are doing amazing work in there. You're seeing so much cool stuff. So what this chart is doing is picking select times this is over the last 90 days time range. So this is 5 second, 10 second, 20 second, 30 seconds. So I'm looking really at a blend that should say Pmax FRC. Look at their decline rate. I can see this decline rate. The blue shows the percentage of decline, and it's up here in this chart. So the reality is, over 5 seconds, this person only has a 1% decline. So that shows there is a decline, hence the point why we use Pmax in a 5 second. By 10 seconds out, they're 6.8 declined. By 20 seconds out, they're 19.3, so we're starting to see some pretty big drop-offs. By 30 seconds out, we're 28.3. Now, what's normative? I don't know. We might learn here soon. We're starting to track all this data, right? But the reality is, if I compared this, we should all know that there's compare mode. You just control-click multiple time ranges. I can see how this person's fatigue resistance has changed. Think about the power of that, right? That really tells you and convinces your athlete or yourself about the effectiveness of training stimuli, or the lack of, always the danger, and also helps you think about performance again and how you might attack events. Attack might be a confusing word. How you might strategize winning an event. If you don't like it over 4 periods, in that same chart pack, this is it at all time periods. So basically, the green is a mean max power, right? And the upcoming red is fatigue percentage. So what's interesting, you see in this person really going all out, they really have a transition point happen around 20, 25 seconds. This helps me in a lot of ways understand, A, their performance. I don't want them sprinting 35 seconds out, do I? I don't want them going super hard in a 35, 40 second set up the brake move, because they're going to fade. They're going to be done. Training-wise, I might, if I'm trying to improve their fatigue resistance, this is the area I'm going to prescribe. I'm going to be able to see where they really fall into limit problems. I'm seeing this point of decline, and I'm going to be able to understand training. This is actually reflected in their eye levels also, which I'll show you, but think about what it's doing for me for training stimuli. If I want to make this person better at the longer sprint, I'm going to prescribe 20 to, I don't know, at first maybe 30 seconds, assume kind of 30 seconds is here. See if I can't push this green out and push the red down. I hope that makes sense, because this is a very interesting chart to use. It's capped at a minute in what you're looking at. You can expand it just by tweaking the expression out to 2, 3, 5. I use 5 in mine just to see the whole range. In this, it really helps this idea, and I was actually giving you an example before I showed you, of defining specificity. So if I understand the athlete, think about all the things coming together here. I understand their fiber type, I understand their Pmax, I understand how many kilojoules they have in the bank. I understand points of deflection where they're really degrading in performance and where fatigue resistance gets soft. And I also have these transitional understandings. So I'm using the rider's physiology in the event, whatever the specific demands are. Do I want them long sprinting or short climb or whatever it might be, to go in and build into an intensive and extensive specific training strategy. So if you think about things that influence FRC, we actually have 3 training zones that impact your FRC. So go back to that multicolored chart, right, where I showed the transition, of classic levels to new. If I want intensive FRC, I'm working at the PMC FRC side, this high side, somewhere between, high 6 to all the way through 7A. If I want FRC extensive, right, I'm working middle of FRC to FTP, FRC range 5. So one of the things we're trying to change the mentality is don't think about everything as a light switch, a transition. We said training levels, and training levels are transitional, but because you have to put them somewhere with a line in between to help you understand them, we think about them as finite, and they're transitional. So understanding this relationship, which is really interesting, look at the FRC and where FRC kind of goes to FRC Pmax. It's right around 29 seconds, right? Look at this, look where they're really fatiguing. It's right in here. I mean, this is a logarithmic curve, so they're losing, 29 seconds is probably right there. So we're seeing the training eye levels help and support by thinking this extensive, intensive training out. If I want to extend, I need to go out to that time range. I'm picking time first and then looking back at the target power. I hope that makes sense. That's a very powerful trick I just showed you. Let's visually look at it for a second in relationship to the power duration curve. So if you want to get even more specific with intervals, this is a chart. These are power duration curve interval chart pack. I think it's in your chart library. If not, you can ask me for it. I'll send it. I think I just put it in the Facebook group also, which just go to Facebook and search WKO4 group. So Matt, you'll find it under WKO4 group. All I did here was take the power duration curve and I took a slight percentage of decline, and taking the time ranges, I just put a line on the time range of Pmax and FRC, the same zone we were working on. Now I'm not live at the moment, but if I was scanning over this, it would be showing me my exact target power. So it would tell me exactly my high-low range of a 20-second or a 30-second or a 45-second effort to get the maximal benefit. So really I'm showing extensive. If I was doing my extensive work, I'd be down here. If I was doing my intensive work, I'd be up here. But now I can be even more specific. I mean, it's doing the same thing eye levels is doing, right? I'm not doing zone 5, I'm really looking at 6 and 7 here. But I'm showing you on a curve because if I wanted to prescribe a 40-second interval, I could be that precise just by hovering over 40 seconds, and I could show that. This is based on the athlete's unique physiology, so it's predicting the maximum response. Instead of saying, wow, let's just increase your anaerobic capacity, go out and do 2-minute intervals, you now actually have data to really specifically target that athlete and use it in your training work. So some workout ideas and examples. So let me stop there because I got a bunch of questions built up. Any info available using VAM and FRC? Looked for a chart and found none. John, no. There's clearly going to be some relationship to VAM. VAM, obviously you have to have a certain amount of climbing to make VAM work and to create a VAM speed, but it's very trackable. As a matter of fact, all I would do, VAM is the expression for VAM, and I would take that and the FRC and cross them and see what happens. I would take a max VAM, like your max VAM, or maybe your greatest 10 VAMs over, who knows, a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and then cross it with FRC, and I bet you money a pattern would emerge. That's a good idea. If anybody here is on the Facebook group, knowing that as soon as we suggest an idea, somebody creates it, create that one, I bet you would be a interesting relationship. Then I would cross it against MFTP too, and I bet you would give you further insight because those are definitely 2 key factors affecting VAM. Second question, installed the physiological marker chart to get fiber type. It gave the same VO2 max that was tested with gas exchange earlier this year. Good work. Yeah, I'd like to take all the credit for that, but that was Andy. So give that one to Dr. Coggin. Yeah, it's a pretty good construct. I mean, it does a pretty good job. I mean, relatively speaking, mine's on and my athletes seem to be right on, so it definitely helps. The reality is we've all been taught that you can't improve VO2 max. I'm going to show you something about that. You can. Fully trained, you can't improve VO2 max, but it is improvable. Final question is about the Facebook group. Just go to Facebook, search WKO4 Facebook group and join it. It's a big group with a lot of smart people, way smarter than me. All right, workouts and some ideas here. Again, I always go back to this intensive and extensive. Intensive shorter, absolute max, full recovery, longer rest. I will tell you the #1 problem, and Andy and I were talking about it this afternoon. I asked him if I could quote him, and he said absolutely. Roadies, as he says, do not understand how to do maximal intervals. And he's totally right, because we lack patience, we associate just pain and gain, and we just want to ride our bikes, right? If you really want to improve your FRC power, do maximal intervals. So 6 times short FRC Pmax on the edge intervals. So I'm telling you, right in that on the edge with the FRC Pmax. So if you're looking here, you're right here. So I'm going 29 seconds. I might go 30 to make the math simple in that sense. Full on. And I'm recovering 7 to 10 minutes in between. Write this note down. Everybody write this down. Just because your heart rate and breathing returns to normal doesn't mean you're recovered. There are other systems at play in maximal efforts. There's energy, there's muscle, there's other factors. Recover. If you're prescribing this as a coach and you want to see breakthroughs, force your athlete to do harder intervals with longer recoveries and hit maximum. They're not looking at a number, they're not doing anything. They are absolutely cross-eyed. Don't even worry about the number. Is there a go-home number? Yeah, you still put that out there. You still want them to not just flog themselves for nothing, but even that on maximal intensities. So take that tip home and you'll be surprised at how much more effectiveness you could build in your FRC training, improving your functional reserve capacity, anaerobic work capacity. But the same reality is extensive, where most of us tend to feel more normal. Here you're doing 2 sets of 5 times FRC FTP edge. So you notice I use that edge. I don't prescribe anymore at 4 minutes, 5 minutes, even though it tends to, I still use that a certain amount of thinking. I'm using the relationship in the curve, and I'm using eye levels to find more productive times if it is. It gives me better and better insight into what it takes to improve when I'm looking to improve, you know, a unique metric. Tracking, I use the same tracking setup. I don't think these are the same time range. I don't even think these are the same athletes, no. So here you see an athlete build. We see FRC coming along with it, no reaction in here, base training probably, not a lot of fatigue, as you can see, not a lot of TSB. This is a slow build. They start getting some form, they get in shape, bam, they test out, they start doing some work, FRC responds, but they get off it again. Kind of settles in, a little bit of work in here, moves it, not a lot of movement there, but I can just see that, you know, this low trough, a lot of TSB in here, really was a little bit of an odd relationship there, right? They were probably coming fresh here. I could see just the edge of the TSB. So just a quick look, tracking. I look at it. I want to know if prescriptions I'm doing are effective. Modeled FTP. Because I don't have a lot on FTP, I'm going to give you 2 points, 2 things because I received this question like once or twice or 3 times a week. MFTP, functional threshold power, in the end of the day, for most of us for training, is the biggest bang in the buck. If you're like, wow, I'm limited somewhat on time, not totally limited, like 4 or 5 hours. Let's say you can train like 8 to 10 hours a week, which is the average working person like me, right? That's what I get, maybe a little more here and there. Focusing on your threshold will give you the biggest bang for the buck. Doing so in a way that improves your fatigue resistance will give you a bigger bang for the buck. When you're looking at things, the misconception is, when it comes to threshold, is I don't think people understand, if well focused on, how much they can actually change threshold. It's easier to think about it in power sense. So I put this chart, this is Andy's chart from his annual planning presentation. Short-term training, weeks to months, we can move threshold by 30 to 45%. It gives us the biggest single improvement also. And over time, we can move it an additional, so thinking years of training, an additional 20 to 30%. And the physiological cost is just not that high. Also note here that we can move VO2 max, this idea that we can't train VO2 max. You can't train and improve its natural genetic max, but you can improve what you do with it. And so when you think about threshold training, these two can sort of go hand in hand, and it is the single biggest bang for the buck. Threshold training is simple. Spend some time riding at just sub-threshold, sweet spot, 95%, whatever works for you. Build duration at that. At some point, you turn up the heat and you start riding threshold and slightly above threshold. So you're pushing threshold up from below first, and then you're pulling it up from above second. Add a couple of VO2 max workouts into that, and it'll work. I'm going to sort of give you an example in a moment. Here's why. VO2 max sets the upper limit for aerobic exercise. That's what it is. It is one's muscular metabolic fitness, as reflected by FTP, determines how much of that aerobic upper limit you can be used. Take a screenshot of that right there. People don't get that. In some ways, it should be a blinding flash of the obvious, because I bet you every smart coach and athlete here is thinking about that. So if the VO2 max is your maximum, right, and you can train it and get a little more peak out of it, as I just showed you, training threshold is the way that you can maximize from your muscular metabolic fitness use of that. So people who might have a high natural VO2 max but are training and aren't doing any work in FTP zone don't access it and use it. But yet you all know stories of somebody who might have been a pretty good pro who didn't have the highest VO2 max in the world, but yet got every little bit out of it. Typically, that's purely by their ability to focus on raising that threshold to the highest possible number, which is really, or that functional threshold, which is really their muscular metabolic fitness underneath. So there's a cool little tip, not a how-to, but a little bit of a highlight about the importance of raising threshold. Final area is our newest metric, which is stamina, and I see a typo. Dang it. I almost made it without. So make sure you guys don't capture the screen. You know what, it's going to get confusing, but I'm going to fix it right now so that on the recording, nobody gets confused. There we go. Let me just go back to presentation mode and swap these two. Oh boy, that's not going to go well. Yeah, I knew that was going to happen. Okay, I'm not going to be able to escape that for a moment. So let me just put that there. Not good. I just blew up my stuff. But live and learn. Okay, so stamina is a measure of resistance to fatigue during prolonged duration, moderate intensity, i.e. sub-FTP exercise. Units are percent of maximum, 0 to 100%, although most individuals will fall in a range of 75 to 85%. I had it wrong before. Pretty simple explanation here, and because I lost all my other screens, I want to make sure what I have coming up. I actually have it on another computer so I can look. It's a simple theory here, right? The idea is that stamina, that in time ranges past 1 hour is, and that's what we're scoring in stamina, time ranges past approximately an hour, beyond FTP. 100% would mean you were totally resistant to fatigue. And totally resistance to fatigue means that your tail end, your power duration curve, would never go down after an hour. It would just be flat, right? Because you wouldn't fatigue. Obviously, that's not possible. It's not physiologically possible. So the idea is by introducing percentages, it gives us some understanding of the decline rate after. I don't want to call it slope because that's mathematically misleading, but it does create the correct visual. I have a really good visual of it. I'll show you once I fix my screen. Some different things we can do with it. I took the same idea, fiber type. Clearly there's a relationship. I stole this from Andy's Facebook. You can see here he's looking at muscle fiber type and his highest stamina ratings. You can see that there is a relationship that as he creates more slow twitch fiber, or as he's more trained towards the slow twitch, he's getting better numbers in this pack. So it just gives us some insight that that ability has improved his stamina, whatever training and focus. This is multiple years. He has this great way of looking at all his years because he's got such clean, good data. This stamina-based tracking is in your chart library. I like this chart in a lot of ways except one. Here's your power duration curve. Here's your MFTP. So MFTP is pretty related to stamina, just based, remember what I just showed you a couple of moments ago about VO2 max being the upper limit cap and MFT being the functional ability to use it. Stamina is somewhere out here. The line isn't some magic intersection point. The line is this whole range. Somehow I got to fill it in or make it work better. But this athlete has a pretty good MFTP, or at 371. Their stamina is about 76%. So they're a little short on the stamina. You know, and this is classic. This is a mountain bike racer who is racing World Cup cross country, which these days, you know, is an hour 45. A lot of intensity, not as much stamina. We're really drilling threshold and other factors, but after that, and you can even see it in his power duration curve, a pretty good drop off. So if he was to move to marathon events or something like that, we would have to change our training strategy and attempt to build some stamina and make that number more like 80, 85. If I could show you my pro stage racer, he's a she, you would see a number in the very high 80s, and just incredible stamina in that way. My problem is I see questions, and now you guys are going to have to see my question screen because I can't revert my screen easily. Robert Smith saying he's not seeing stamina in the chart library. I think it just got added this afternoon, Robert. If not, it'll be live by tomorrow. I'll tell everybody there's going to be in the next day or two an article, or next couple of days, an article coming out in TrainingPeaks that I wrote and Andy contributed to about stamina much more in depth, and the pack will be linked to it. If not, just email me after at tim@WKO4 and refer to the pack by name, and I'll send it to you. If you don't refer to it by name, I'll forget. When you start thinking about the components of stamina, it's important because if you're thinking about improving it, you need to think about what the components are. Let me just see if I can fix this screen. You guys, I'm so sorry for the technical. I've done this before, and it literally, once my computer goes to it, it won't let go. Yeah, which is true. So it won't let go. Okay. We have muscular endurance, aerobic capacity, and FTP. The reality is those components work together. So muscular endurance is a term in cycling when we're talking about endurance that I love-hate, because it's really not muscular endurance, particularly when we think about the limiter. We're really probably talking about cardiovascular, respiratory, muscular endurance, a combination of things working together. Muscular endurance really is a strength training term. I'm going to curl this weight. How many times can I curl it? It applies here, and it's similar because it's a repetitive use of the same exercise, movement, muscle, whatever you want to call it. But in cycling, it's rarely the pure limiter. Your cardiovascular, respiratory reality would limit. And as a matter of fact, your cardiovascular might be the biggest limiter in that sense. Your heart usually limits you before your lungs. So, which both usually would limit you before your muscular endurance would totally fade. Obviously, there's exceptions and change in that, but there's a reality there. Aerobic capacity is this idea of maintenance of VO2 max. I mean, it really can be that simple, right? You want to take maximal advantage. If you raise your VO2 max, effort over time is less stressful on the body. If I'm able to perform at a closer level and to my VO2 max, and I raise it first and then I perform closer to it, that's less stress, less strain, less demand, less energy use. And that's what FTP is. So this idea of aerobic capacity, raising your maximum aerobic capability, and at the same time building and maintaining FTP underneath that is really the secret to stamina. They meet in the middle. What I see too often as soon as you say stamina is too slow, too long, everything's slow and long. There's absolutely, and you're going to see me say it here in the next slide, duration plays a key role in the development of stamina, but also managing intensity in those zones. And I personally, and opinion alert, I absolutely believe that even long-term endurance, even a person competing in an Ironman needs to do some work to maintain that aerobic capacity and some other factors on muscular endurance and stuff like that. So I'm taking a quick drink. So those three components work together. By building your aerobic capacity, you're making less demand after an hour. So if I can maintain 200 watts on a threshold of 300 on a VO2 max of 80, that's less demand than 200 watts on a VO2 max of 75 and a threshold of 250. And it's simply making the effort less demand for maintaining power or pace. Same reality with FTP, right? The higher I raise my FTP, there's less demand for maintaining certain pace. I typically suggest running, like when it comes to triathlons and legs and stuff like that, you might want to be somewhere between 70 and 75% of FTP is your cycling leg, depending on the length of the event. Well, the higher we raise that FTP, we can also make that number higher. You go faster. But it also might give us the ability to run it at a percent or two less and allow us to run better because it creates less demand. So by tracking and managing stamina, I can understand that relationship and potentially tweak some performance predictions. Muscular endurance really is about improving sustainability. It's about you recruit muscles in a very patterned way. You're recruiting, through the same kind of slow twitch, fast twitch evolution. Part of that is you're also transitioning fibers. This will go in depth in the article. Part of why you want longer progression is not only kind of mitochondria and aerobic and all the other benefits, is your fast twitch 2 or fast twitch B muscles under any kind of training really, but particularly under what we're talking here, will begin to behave more and more like slow twitch, which will improve your efficiency, improve your ability to access them, will improve your fatigue resistance. So again, muscular endurance is a little bit of a catch-all phrase, but you're improving cardiovascular, respiratory, you're improving how you recruit fibers, you're transitioning fast twitch B to act more like slow twitch muscle, and generally building fatigue resistance. Building stamina, a couple of key things to think about and some tips. One, progress your work. There's been this rule around about progressing 10% a week. It's a pretty good rule. I can tell you the data we crunch and stuff like that says, yeah, that's a pretty good starting point. It doesn't mean you can't have variations and other stuff, but it's a pretty good rule. Progress your duration in zones 2 and 3. Be careful of zone 1 or higher zones and stuff like that, as you're building stamina. A lot of time or unplanned time to being anaerobic is troublesome. I will tell you right now, a stamina killer, one of the things I'm learning now that we have the metric and I'm looking at more and more athletes, is the absolute killer of stamina is group riding. I bet you there's a lot of people right now shaking their head going, yeah, I can see that. Because what happens in group riding, too much active recovery time, too much FRC time, not enough time in the middle. And over time, if you go watch somebody going from training, a lot of zone 2 and 3 and threshold kind of work maybe, and then they start group riding and just kind of, you watch the transition in stamina, within, 4, 5, 6 weeks, it just plummets. It's a pretty interesting metric. So you need the proper zones as you progress duration. You need to progress each ride duration. One of the things that people don't do enough is a long ride, particularly if you want stamina. The old kind of men's training rule and is 4,000 kilojoules. It tends to be more like 3,000, 3,200 kilojoules for women, only because of size. The reality is that's this thinking about how your body makes energy and everything else. If you want to progress your stamina, you need at least one longer ride a week. Might be 2 weeks. Life, unless you're a professional athlete, you're doing what you can do. And I would recommend finding one of those rides. I know when I need to get in shape, I need 1 5 to 6 hour ride a week. I'd love to get 4 or 5. If I had the time, maybe I would. But the reality is I can get a pretty good stamina response off 1 day a week. Here's a trick in riding and getting the maximum out of the ride progressively. So many recreational category race riders ride anti-progressively. What that means, if you break down your 5-hour ride, your 4-hour ride, your 6-hour ride, your first hour is generally the fastest, maybe the second hour, then the third, fourth, fifth, just drop, drop, drop as that fatigue sets in. Ride at the reverse. Go out the first hour and chill more. Just ride at the lower zone of what you're targeting and just try to go maybe 5-10 watts harder every hour. That's going to force you to start a little easier. You're still recruiting muscle fibers in the same fashion. You're still in that first hour creating a generally 99% similar aerobic demand. You'll be stronger later and you'll better train stamina in your body. So just think about riding progressively. It's an oversimplification, but it is a pretty effective tool. Second, introduce and improve higher intensity. In longer rides, you can drop in longer tempo work. So the way I'll often do it with somebody limited with time, if they get to 12 hours, is I might do like a long ride Sunday, but if I get them long on Wednesday or Thursday, it's a big benefit. So let's say they're doing a 5-hour Sunday, I might do a 3.5 to 4-hour Thursday, but I drop tempo into that Thursday every time. Start at 45 minutes, build it to an hour, build it to 90 minutes. I could show you one of my pros who can ride tempo for almost 4 hours. The reality is, and it's the one with all that slow twitch muscle fiber, by the way. The reality is, you know, you have to break away this idea of traditional zones or levels at times and just know, don't get me wrong, I couldn't ride 4 hours of tempo. Probably very few people could do it here, but I can, well trained, get mine out to about 2. And when I hit 2, I crack, and I have to call my wife to come pick me up or something. But I'll tell you, like a training ride for me, because I get this question all the time too, is when I'm training to get on shape, my Thursday is about almost a 4-hour ride. It's about a 3.5-hour ride. I do the local metric century course, and I try to break 3 hours. So basically I warm up for 15, 20 minutes. I hit the course. I go right at tempo. I maintain a mid-range tempo until I fall apart, and then I do everything I can to crawl home. And the reality is that's extensive building here, because each time I do it, I'll do it every Thursday. I try to go further till I crack. So at first time I do it in the year, I might only hold that tempo for 90 minutes, and then I have to drop, to high endurance, then I have to drop to medium endurance. By, 4 or 5 or 6 weeks of doing that, I might be holding, 2 hours or maybe even more, 2.5 hours. So just a simple example. That's unstructured training for me. I'm not running plans, but that's an unstructured approach. Next, maintain your FTP. I would schedule 2 to 5 per macro cycle. If I'm really going for an endurance event and stamina is important to me, let's say an Ironman or something like that, I still want to do some FTP work. A macro cycle is typically 4 weeks in the sense of traditional progression, and kind of following a system of some type of progressive overload and micro and macro and a periodized plan. But, by age or other factors that might be different. So you're just sprinkling some in there to do that FTP work. I would initially use Sweet Spot to push it up from the bottom so that you're limiting your time over FTP. Problem is when you go out and do FTP threshold intervals, like right at threshold, and let's say you're building for a long-term event, a long endurance event, you're spending half the time over an anaerobic, and you might not get all you want. Then I would also maintain your VO2 max. 1 to 2 per cycle. Just do it a day after you rest a day or two, or maybe after your rest block, a couple of days, week, whatever you take. Come back and just do a great hard FRC or FRC FTP or FRC kind of work in that range, and just get in 1 or 2 good works per cycle. I just believe you want to maintain and see if you can't tweak that a little higher to build. If you kind of put that together, this action is probably the most effective way to build stamina. I would remind you that it's just a score. So as a score, I would really encourage people to track it over time. This is a report I built. It's just, I'm looking at stamina versus peak 3 hours versus this athlete. So, and this is my last slide, you guys, before questions, I think. When their stamina right now is 70, I see, in 2016, right now it's 79. Back in 2015, it was 71. Their 3-hour peak average right now is 276 watts. Back here, their average was 215 watts. So we actually did, I know who this athlete is now that I see it, we did a lot of work. Literally, this person stepped off the couch, was a pro in his early 20s. In his late 30s, I met him a couple of years ago when he was 39. I just wanted to get back into it after 15 years of not riding. And you can see this 2015 year was his comeback year, and you can see how much improvement he's made in that process. So you want to compare and look at stamina versus numbers. Okay, let's go to Q&A. I'm going to try doubly hard. There, I got it. So, to get all my stuff back on the right screens here so I can answer questions appropriately. Sorry about that interruption. Let's see what I got here question-wise. And one, I appreciate you guys' time on there. I should have cut a couple of slides out. It was a long, rough day of illness. Been curious. So here's a question. I'll pick a couple of good ones out here. Been curious. What is the most time that someone could spend at or above threshold in a total day event? 60 minutes is an obvious limiter, but someone like that cross country, can they do 90 minutes of threshold or 120? No, it's actually a good question. People don't think 60 minutes. I mean, one of the things that Andy and I have worked so hard on is not getting everybody to think 60 minutes, 60 minutes, 60 minutes. Really, threshold can be anywhere. You're at your threshold, or you can only maintain threshold probably anywhere from 40 to maybe 70, 75. A well-trained athlete can kind of get out there if they absolutely had to. But yeah, an hour is a pretty good range. Probably a better question to me, if you're talking about a cross-country racer, is, and particularly, different things, is segments of that and numbers underneath. For me, a cross-country racer, that extensive FRC is super important. You need threshold and extensive FRC to be a successful cross-country racer. You need the threshold because the ups and downs and efforts is always high. You need the extensive FRC because the way terrain tends to play in the game in cross-country racing, and you need extensive FRC for the start. If you look and break down a lot of mountain bike racing at any level, it actually tends to happen. The position you're in the first 10 to 12 minutes, you're going to finish pretty close to that position because they tend to start so hard and intensively. The FRC demand is so high, you empty that tank right away. And yeah, there's comeback and you pass people who went too hard and crack. But if you look at a good, high-level race, where they're at in the first 12 minutes, pretty much within a position or two of where they're going to finish, at the front. It could be a big pack, but I think you get the point. So having that FRC available in the tank to start hard and then deal with terrain is super important. Okay, a lot of other charts, questions. So you guys, if you don't see it in the chart library, like I said, just email me, Tim at WKO4, I'll get them to you, or I'll load them to the chart library and I'll respond back saying I put them in the chart library. That's why we built the chart library, so you guys could find them. Facebook group, yeah, you have to ask for an invite, we'll be glad to join you. We have very low standards, you're welcome. I know I see some people here that are very good at posting really cool and unique ideas. So we appreciate you guys doing that. All right, that's it. I think all the other questions will come to me directly. Thanks, everybody. I know that went a little long. I appreciate the patience. Hopefully there was some good learning. Feel free to ask me questions coming up. And thanks, and I hope everybody has a good night.